podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the fourth Sunday of Easter for the week of April 26th, 2026. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I am excited. Here we are with Good Shepherd Sunday, and it's always kind of a fun moment here within the church year. It's great imagery that we like using with this Sunday. A lot of the text will kind of revolve around that, and I think it gives us some ideas. And I know in the past we've talked about some different things with that. We're going to look at it a little bit differently this year, but I think it's a comforting moment, but it can also be still hard at that same time, depending on what's going on and within life circumstances. But I think it's also this aspect of recognizing God as this protector, as this provider, is such an important image for us as we are going through the highs and the lows of life, to be able to recognize how God continues to walk through it with us through all of it, and is able to then help in those times bring out who we are and whose we are, and being able to empower us into the next phase or next chapter of life, whether it's going from a high or a low, that God's able to do that. And I think in a lot of ways, when we have that type of conversation, it brings us well into the question that we had for last week, which was, where have you lived into your talents and where do you still need to grow? And it was some great examples we got this week, but even the ability on how God uses us musically, how God uses our just different talents and abilities, and is able to move us into the next phase of life, being able to pull us into careers and where God is pulling us, and being able to utilize those different skills, different abilities, and finding ways to continue to weave that in. And so I had an answer talking about how music for them had been utilized throughout their life and within their ministry and different works that they've done. I know for me, there has been interest within music. I play percussion. I play drum sets at multiple different churches. I've done that now over the last 15, 20 years. So this aspect and this idea of being able to utilize these gifts and do them in different ways. So I think it's this aspect of ourselves and continuing to find and recognize what are the different gifts and talents, and how is God planning on utilizing them? Is it for a season or is it for a lifetime? And how is that going to be utilized and brought forward into the next phase of life? So let's just jump into it. The first reading this week is out of Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. This continues on from the reading that we had last week. So if you remember, we had the Romans kind of coming together and recognizing we killed Jesus. What do we do now? And this then is kind of that beginning of, okay, you are going to then commit to this, and that this is going to be a community. This is going to be the beginnings of the church in a lot of ways, that we're going to have this time where we're gathered together. And in that, they were the amazing sights and things that we see within church communities, the wonders and signs of what God is doing. There is the bringing it together for the common good. They are sharing their possessions and distributing the goods to make sure that everyone is being taken care of. And day by day, they're spending more and more time together, and this being able to amplify the praise that God is deserving. This recognition on how then through this transformation of what God does within us and who we are and whose we are, because of that recognition, that in that then it changes our behavior. It allows us to be able to grow and become these different people and become more aligned to who God is wanting us to be, and being able to then serve all of us because of that. We are working as a better unified body, big body of Christ at that moment. The psalm this week is arguably the most familiar psalm that all of us know, Psalm 23, all 6 verses of it. And so that's where we get, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And we get the first 4 verses talking about it from that, laying down in green pastures and leading us beside still waters, restoring our soul and leading us on right paths. And then we start getting this transition beginning in about verse 4. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And then it's this aspect of, as then we are being provided for, we then see the abundance of God. You have prepared a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. That's kind of a prophet type of welcome there. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. This recognition, again, I think, especially when we look at these last two verses, that in the presence of my enemies, the idea that there are times that even though we have opinions about things, God has different opinions. And I think at times, and especially at times how divisive our world can get, we have to remember that God's table is different than our table. And we have to then be okay with that, no matter how difficult that may be for us. And I think it's something that they continue to bring toward God and being able to recognize that. And I think there isn't necessarily one way that's right and one way that's wrong. I think it's a lot of adjusting and trying to align ourselves with what God is wanting. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 19 to 25. This then is a very common section of scripture that's kind of getting into, we have to be aware and acknowledge that in this faith, there are going to be hardships. There are going to be things that we're going to have to go through that is hard, that we're suffering, but we have to recognize this is a fraction of what was done to Christ. That in this, we are able to recognize that what Christ did on our behalf was much worse and went through all the abuse and all this stuff so that we can be acknowledged and be righteous and be part of the family and seen as forgiven sons and daughters of Christ. That we don't have to do anything more because of that. We have been forgiven. It acknowledges us to go deeper, to figure out then where are we going to move because of what has been done for us. And in this, then we have to recognize that we are all in this together. And then we get back here in verse 25, for you are going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and the guardian of your souls. This recognition of how God brings us back, and it's bringing it back in that idea of the shepherd mentality here at the end of 1 Peter. The gospel text this week then is out of John chapter 10, the first 10 verses of it. And this is the I am the gate of Jesus. It's this recognition on how the sheep can have bandits, thieves come in, but they don't listen. There isn't that acknowledgement. And we've talked about this in years past, how sheep become very accustomed to the way that the shepherd guides them, the way that shepherd interacts with them, the voice of the shepherd. And we get this acknowledgement of this in this text when we start looking at like verses 4 into 5, that they do not follow, they don't know the voice of the stranger, that they're coming in, but they don't obey and follow them. They are part of the flock of Jesus. They are part of the flock of God, and that they're going to continue following after that. And that many enter in and are part of this illustrious flock, but it's recognizing that you are part of it. You are not alone in this. You're not a lone ranger. It's something that you have been welcomed into, and that we're all then helping each other in this. It's not something that is an individualistic thing. This is where it's one of these moments that we're being looked at much more in a flock mentality and recognizing that we are entering in as individuals, but joining into a community at large. And at how in that we are acknowledging that the shepherd is the one guiding us, not our individual passions and our individual decisions that we have individually. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, do our shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, ways to be looking at these texts. They have a lot of great historical podcasts and commentaries going through these texts, and it's extremely helpful to be able to get some different ideas, different ways of looking at these texts and thinking about it. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, and it's what I use every week. But they also have some great art, prayers, hymns, the colors, even daily readings to get you into the text to prepare for that upcoming worship service. Whether you are going to be in front of the pews or in the pews, I feel that these are extremely important times to be digging into these and looking into this stuff. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies within the weekly lectionary, very similar to like what I'm doing here on this podcast week after week, or they have a monthly newsletter that includes that along with some different notices of events and different resources, some green notes. If you enjoy listening to this podcast, but definitely would like more of an environmental slant on some things, I'd highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. They'll be the first link down in the show notes in the references section. I think it's hard sometimes, and especially being a person in the United States of America, recognizing how in the faith there are sacrifices that sometimes need to be made. And we can talk about persecution and that whole aspect of things, but I think truly most Americans have really never been persecuted for their faith. No matter what we may be hearing within the political sphere right now, overall, we really haven't been persecuted for our faith. And actually, next week, we'll have a better example of that. But I think it also reminds us within the faith, it means that we are individuals, but we're part of something much bigger. And we have to be part of that, not just be purely focused on the individual aspect of this. And in doing that, it helps tune our ear to where the voice of the shepherd is guiding us. And if we are acknowledging that the shepherd knows things and is going to protect us and is going to guide us, we have to be tuned in to that. And this is where I think it really gets interesting is in doing that, it ties in well to the 23rd Psalm that we're recognizing that the shepherd is going to lead us into places that are not only going to help us grow, but help us thrive. And that is something in and of itself is a major shift. It's not just purely for me, it's for all of us, and it's going to benefit all of us. We see that also in the Acts reading with the conversion of people here, the early believers here of the church, they are changing their habits. They are seeing the benefits of working together instead of as individuals. And the recognition on how this is going to benefit multiple different people in and beyond their community. I think that is an image in and of itself that we can lay into, and especially with where I'm located in the Northern Hemisphere and the time of year, I think there's some interesting correlations that we can look at and to think about that can help illustrate this a little bit better. And in order for us to do this, we have to kind of go back, and we've talked about some of this different types of stuff before, but let's talk about whooping cranes. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Fly Away Home, there's a movie talking about, and they utilize Canadian geese for reasons we'll talk about here in a moment, but it's about, you find these birds, the parents are dead, they're trying to raise the young, and they realize that the only way that they're going to be able to actually teach them how to migrate is that they have to pretend to be their parent. And so they use a small aircraft to be able to kind of teach them the migratory route. And this has been a movie that is loosely then based off of what has happened in Baraboo at the now International Crane Foundation, going through and how they were able to teach whooping cranes the secondary migratory route on how to migrate and where to migrate for them to be able to reestablish a population, and thus being able to teach this over generation. And we've talked about whooping cranes before in the past, how it's an extremely endangered species here in the world, and especially in North America, that we're talking at most a few thousand birds. And these are huge birds. We're talking birds that are 5 to 6 feet tall, but it's an amazing bird. It's been an amazing recovery story, and I highly recommend checking some of that stuff out. But I think we need to think about the migratory aspect of birds in particular here. First and foremost, birds are dependent on flying in flocks, and we've talked about this before too. You have at this moment where we are in the cycle, depending on where the bird's home range is, if you're further closer to the equator, you maybe have where more of the hormones have increased in the birds. And I'm noticing where I'm at, we're starting to hear where the hormones are starting to creep up, where we're starting to get some more of the breeding calls. But there's also a lot of birds that are still migrating through, that they're still getting to where they need to go. And so thus you're in this transitional phase. But if we think about the fall, we have after usually their second clutch, if they're a 2-clutch bird or a second breeding season, that the hormones drop off. And what are they dependent on? They're dependent on working together to be able to migrate together. And that means young and old, that they're flying this route. And then they're going down south wherever they're going to be. And that then the young are also then watching on the way back as they are flying the way back and figuring out where is the spot to be, where is the appropriate spot for them to be. And we've talked about also that there's been some different studies talking about if they're a first clutch or second clutch bird on where they end up being. That's another conversation for another day. So we're recognizing with things like Operation Migration, which was to help the whooping cranes, but we're recognizing how there is this process of passing this along. And it's not just like whooping cranes that are doing this. We're seeing this in like white storks will do this. Caspian terns, they've been observed where the young are very close to the adults at the whole time during migration to learn that route. Pink-footed goose, the same type of thing. Northern bald ibis. We're recognizing that all these birds then are acknowledging that they have to work together to be able to do this, and that they're having to learn and pass along this idea of where this is the route that we take. This is the way that we do this. Additionally, though, the thing that we have to remember is what is the whole purpose of this? In the fall, they're going south because, and in the northern hemisphere going south, I guess if you're in the southern hemisphere, you'd be going north, but you're migrating in the fall for the aspect of that the resources that you're needing are no longer going to be there, especially like where in the northern half of the northern hemisphere or the southern half of the southern hemisphere, you're going to have colder temperatures. You're going to have less food resources. And so thus they are moving to a place where there is more abundance of food. In doing that, they are also then bringing with them in their scat, they're spreading that out throughout their whole route and being able to potentially help some of these other species grow. They're bringing a diversity of what they've been eating, so essentially bringing different nutrients into some of those soils. But along with it, they're also their behavior and how they're going to be interacting with those ecosystems is going to bring life to those ecosystems. They are bringing something that the ecosystem maybe has only for part of the year, or that it's a transitioning time and the species that was filling that is no longer going to be there. So now they are bringing something that that ecosystem is needing in that period of time. And this allows for life to happen. This allows for the amazing growth of what is going on. It allows for the ecosystem as a whole to benefit beyond what we'd assume the one species is able to do. It's going to impact, if you think about just the plant life, the birds eating different plant life and being able to naturally spread their seed throughout different parts of wherever the bird goes. And a lot of plants have adapted so that the bird's digestive system is not breaking down those seeds so that it's able to spread their seeds to new places, allowing them the possibility to grow. This is bringing life to these new areas. It is allowing for things to be more abundant. If we go back to what we're talking about here with these texts, it's the idea, especially in the Acts text, of we're coming together, we're taking our resources, we're coming together to make something more abundant. We see that in the 5th verse of the 23rd Psalm, that the cup overflows, that we are getting abundance. It's not that we're just being fed. We are being fed in abundance. We are allowing the abundance to happen. Our presence and being part of that is allowing for that abundance to happen. That as we are following the shepherd, yes, there might be hard times. Yes, there are things, but we have to recognize that Christ has done that for us, and it's going to be leading us toward a place where things are better for everyone. Not maybe just for me as an individual, but it's going to be better for the colloquial whole of the faith. It's going to be better for all of us. And that means that we need to be following the shepherd to be able to get to these better pastures, to be able to get to this abundance. Birds are doing that and showing that on a day in, day out basis right now. They're moving from these different places to go to places of abundance. They are teaching their young the route that they must take in order to get to that abundance. And what is the cues and different things of that nature? What does God kind of help them understand to be able to know when do they go, when do they stay, where do they go, where exactly? And we look at that and we can see it just how amazing it is. We've talked about in this podcast before, like how 80% of sandhill cranes go through this 80-mile stretch of the Platte River. There's so many birds there, but there is an abundance of what they are needing. They have protection, they have food, all these things so that they can continue their journey that significant distance. I'm noticing right now where I'm at, there's so many of these different birds that I know are not going to be here in the quantities that I am seeing right now long term. But that they're seeing my yard, they're seeing the bird seed that I have out as a resting place, something of abundance to help them be able to get to where they need to go. In this journey of life that we are all on, I think we have to be able to acknowledge that this isn't something that we should be doing purely by ourselves. This is something that we should be looking to others to help guide us along the way, but also recognizing that there are individual calls within that. And it's one of these things, especially as I've done this podcast over the years, that I've kind of wrestled with that I think is so important for all of us to be wrestling with. That faith is both a community thing and an individual thing, and it can't be one and it can't be the other. It has to be both. Because in that, we recognize that if it's just purely an individualistic thing, there is no reason to be giving back. And if it's purely a community thing, we lose sight of what the gifts and talents that God has given us uniquely to be able to benefit the whole. It's yes to both of those. And I think we can see that in birds migrating. We can see that in how they are having to work together. They're having to teach the way in which their historical migratory routes are. And it's partially for us, why this is so important for us to be talking about this and thinking about this, is the more that we're understanding that, the more we understand how connected we all are. We learned with whooping cranes, we couldn't just raise them in captivity. We couldn't just get the population higher. They weren't going to know what to do. There has to be those able to teach as well. And so for the whooping crane and Operation Migration, we were able to help them do that migratory route to teach them that and how important that is. But it's also an important lesson for us to recognize as we are going through things and the changes that we are noticing within our world environmentally, that it's not just enough to purely be counting the numbers of birds or what's the population density of these. It's recognizing also the impact that they're making beyond just their pure numbers. The impact of what they are doing in their ecosystems that directly affects us as well. And acknowledging our impact within that ecosystem as well. It means that we can't be separating ourselves from God's creation in and of itself. It's acknowledging that we are a part of it and that we are being welcomed into the larger family of God. That may also mean, if we are truly being taking this and acknowledging this, this may also mean that it's not just human. It's not just Homo sapien. It's much bigger than that. If we are wanting to be led by still waters to restore our soul, we need to make sure that there are still waters there. As a gardener, we have to recognize that. That means that we have to be able to acknowledge what is going to be helping to make sure that those still waters are there. And we have to teach others to be able to help get them to that place as well and not lose sight of how valuable it is. There's things politically that I could talk about right now that literally went through Congress this last week that I would argue is taking away those still waters and where I'm at in the Boundary Waters Canoe area for mining reasons. And I'm not going to get into that. But I also would argue we have to recognize the value of things around us. We have to recognize how much things are interconnected. We have to recognize what our role is within that. And the only way that that's going to happen is by being part of it. That's what we can see in the Acts reading. That's what we can see in the John gospel text in John, that we are part of something bigger. In order for us to not be led astray by these thieves and robbers coming in, we need to know the voice of the shepherd. We need to have spent time around the shepherd. We need to then acknowledge the shepherd. And this is sometimes very difficult within our world because it means transforming how we are looking at things and thinking about things in order to better help the larger whole, not just us individually. And that's sometimes hard. As we also have Earth Day coming up this next week, it fits into this idea that we need to be acknowledging and thinking about and embracing how we are part of something much bigger, how we can be teaching, how we can be learning, how we can be growing, and acknowledging that there's sometimes the passing of information that needs to be happening. And in a world that I feel like in certain ways is becoming more disconnected in certain ways, I think that's an important message we need to make sure that we are doing, not just for ourselves, but for communities at large. So the question I have for you this week is, where are you teaching? Where are you learning? And where are you growing? Where are you teaching? Where are you learning? Where are you growing? I think those are ideas, especially as we are still in this Easter season, we need to be working through. There's things within my family that are going on, and I referenced it last week, and I have a feeling I'm going to be referencing it here for a little while, and eventually I'll get into it. But we have to recognize how precious time is. We have to acknowledge how short life really is. And the more things that we can not only figure out for ourselves, but being able to pass along that wisdom is important. And it's part of, for me, I truly believe science is important. Learning about science and how this whole planet and things around us work is awesome. And it breeds into that sense of wonder that I truly believe God is wanting us to embrace. But there's also still the faith aspect that we also can pass along as well, that gives a reason on why we are so curious and why we continue to go out and why what we're learning matters. And I think if we lose sight of those things, we lose sight of so much more. And as we have these texts of bringing people together, bringing the early church together and being able to acknowledge and recognize the voice of God, then we need to make sure that we are spending that time in those right places to truly hear the voice of God and to learn to tune in and where is the voice of God so that we're not led astray. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.